water. It's amazing when you speak in front of people how your throat can become really dry. And so not only do I have a cup of water, but sometimes I'll move. I learned something that when you have adrenaline, a lot of adrenaline, for those of you that the thought of speaking in front of people scares you, your adrenaline goes up. And so kind of moving your hands and feet distributes that. So you'll notice sometimes speakers will move a little bit and fidget. It's getting that adrenaline out. So now that I've called attention to that, my name is Donna Libemday, and I work for an organization. I'm out of Oregon. I work for a statewide organization in Oregon. I am not, in the keynote, going to be talking about substance abuse and suicide, but I do have a breakout on that. Because the organization I work with, I direct prevention programs. And this organization has a statewide crisis lines. And we do a lot of different things around promoting mental wellness and reducing or preventing substance abuse and suicide. So we have our state's crisis hotlines, suicide hotlines, drug and alcohol referral lines, military line. We have a youth line. I'll talk a little bit about that in my breakout. And we do a lot of advocacy work and training. We work with schools. We do lots of work. That's what I do. I've been doing it for a long time. I actually started as a teacher. I taught high school and middle school. And then I went through a phase of having children. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And you'll notice that I didn't put PhD or MPH or Master's in Education. I put MOM because that's really what I want to talk about today. Is I'm a mother. And I am a grandmother as well. I have 7 grandchildren and 4 children. And I'm going to go over some just really simple key things that you know, and I'm going to highlight them, and I'm going to connect them a little bit to me being a mother, to being a daughter, what it meant to grow up, and how that applied to my life, and how I had to work through things so that I could be a better parent. And so I'm a mom. And so the next slide, my first slide. In some sense, every parent loves their children. But what do I mean by that? So that picture, that is my mother and my father. There was 9 of us. We had 9 children. There's 8 in that picture because the 9th one, my 6th brother, was still, my mother was 8 months pregnant, I think, during that picture, that photo. I'm the one in the middle holding my little brother, Jerry, number 5, 5th brother, number 8's child, right? So, I mean, if you look at that, here we are, right? My parents were both pretty healthy, or they came from pretty healthy families. In this picture, we were living in New York. My father was from New York. He was an Irish Catholic, came from a very large family, right? He had 13, grew up in a family of 13 children. His parents were very involved to this day. His siblings all still live in New York, all very close community, pretty healthy people. And my mother the same. My mother is a Pacific Islander. I grew up both here in the United States as well as on Guam. My mother is a Chamorro from Guam. And she grew up in a family of 4 children, also pretty healthy. And they had, she had her mom, she had her dad. They lived in an island. It was pretty laid back. They did a lot of things together. They were close and they were healthy, right? But in some sense, every parent loves their children. My mother and my father were loved, and they had that capacity. The next slide. Some parents are too broken to love them well. So that's my mom and dad. And so, why do I say that? I'm going to talk about trauma a little bit. So my parents are both children who are both young people who were traumatized by a war. So my mother grew up on Guam. In World War II, Guam was in the midst of that war. Right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Guam was bombed, and it was occupied for almost 4 years by the Japanese. It was a really hard time. My mother's memory, I remember her sharing a memory. And she said she was probably 7.5, 8 years old. And they were all in church in the main area in Guam. And then the bombs began to drop. And all she remembers is, at that time, a lot of the people it was a Sunday. So they were in church, and bombs started falling, and they started hitting that area of the island. And so all she remembers is running through the jungles of Guam. Because my grandparents and a lot of the people on the island lived in the center main area, but most of them also had ranches far away, and they just spent that day just running. And the reason we had that conversation is as a child, I noticed she had scarring on her legs, and I wanted to know why. And so late, she kind of told me this story. And so my mother was traumatized by war, not only through that, but the take back, when the Americans came back and ended that war. 17,000 Japanese soldiers were killed on Guam through that bombing. There was 20,000 Chamorros, or people on Guam at that time, when that bombing occurred. They lost lives throughout that occupation, and then through the bombing, that island was destroyed in many ways by all that bombing. So much so that my grandfather, and a few years later, decided to leave the island. Why am I telling you this? Because my mother had a pretty good family. She had a good community. She had parents that loved her. She was traumatized by war. And not only was my mother traumatized by war, but my father was also. Because my father, who was a young Irishman in New York, for some reason, I'm not quite sure, sometimes I think families have stories they don't share. I don't know my father's story, but at 17, he joined the Navy. My grandfather, he was the oldest, and he was expected actually to be a priest. But he joined the Navy at 17 years old, right after World War II. And then 2 years later, a year and a half after he joined, so he was barely 19 years old, the Korean War broke out, and my father fought in the Korean War. That's really interesting too, is that he was traumatized by war. One time when I was 16 or 17 and our family was going through counseling, which I'll talk about in a second, my father told a story, and as a typical 16 and 17-year-old who had already gone through a lot with my father and was pretty angry at him, I remember listening to his story, and he shared that when he was in the Korean War, the soldiers, as they were on that foreign land and fighting, there was an orphanage. And the soldiers began to help and volunteer at the orphanage. Children who were losing their families and through the war, right? And the soldiers began to become connected and build relationships, and that became a healing part for them and for those children. And then that orphanage got bombed, and all those children were killed. That traumatized my father, right? He was traumatized by war, and he was traumatized by the loss of these children and seeing these children killed in war. Both my parents. So here they are. They both are really good families, and they come from pretty good communities, and they had parents that loved them, and they're both traumatized, right? Some parents, right? What I was saying, most parents love their children, but some are too broken to love them well. That's my story. I'm going to go a little bit into it, but what I want to talk to you about, I'm going to stop with that story for a second, because there's three key things I want to talk to you about. And there was a study that was done, and it's become very commonly known, and people continue to build on that study. And it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences. Kaiser Health Agency, right? And I won't go into all the details, that's not what I really want to share. But I do want to teach you something or help you see something. So this study, what they noticed was they're asking themselves, why do some people have a lot of these health risks, or why are we seeing some of these problems? What contributes to that? Can we understand it? Man, if we could understand it, if we could understand why some people suffer with diabetes and some people suffer from alcoholism, or some people suffer, more. Why do some people have more of these, not only behavioral or emotional, mental problems, but also some physical problems? Why do some people seem to have it more? What is the connections? Is it the way they eat? Is it what they do? What is it, right? And so they looked at those behaviors. So they had this population of people that were coming in for their services. And so they looked at those behaviors. They began to identify key behaviors, right, over a period of time. In fact, this initial study, ended up looking at 17,000 people, so yeah, 17,000. So the next slide, treat about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So this study was about adverse childhood experiences, right? Childhood experiences that are really hard. Now they we have all been exposed to lots of different things. There's lots of different things that traumatize us as we're growing up, right? That we may or may not have control over. What they wanted to know was, what are some of the common adverse problems? And they weren't working with they were working with a typical, I think most of the people in this study were your typical good families like my mom and my dad, right? They were people who, you know, they might have struggled, but they were making a living, they were providing for their children, they were doing pretty good, but they're having these health issues. And so then they came up with the survey and they began to look at 10, they identified 10 common things, right? They looked at, 3 of those are on abuse, right? Physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Neglect, right? Physical, emotional neglect. Household, what they would call household dysfunction, that was the 3rd category. Is there mental illness in the home? Is someone struggling with that? Or somebody incarcerated that's close to the family, right? Is domestic violence part of the home, right? Is there substance abuse? And by that, right, we mean anywhere from alcohol to illegal drugs. Is it abused? Is it used to the place and to the point where it's not healthy for them or the people they love? And they can't stop it, even though everything in them doesn't want to do that. Doesn't want to see themselves hurting. Doesn't want to see their children and their family hurting, and yet they can't stop, right? Substance abuse, addiction, or divorce. And so they found that those are 10 common adverse experiences, that high percentages of the population have at least one of those. And so they looked at all these sicknesses, and then they looked at all these types of experiences that are pretty adverse. And this is what they found. The next slide. They found, what they do is they look at, let's say they look at my father. And war is not on there. Major trauma is not on there because not everybody's experienced that, right? But they might look at an individual. My dad died at 48 years old of a massive heart attack. So they would look at him, right? And they would do this survey and they might ask him, so in your home, when you were growing up, before you were 18, right? Was physical abuse a part of your life? Was it pretty, no, right? But they would begin to ask those, they would look at those 10 factors and they'd ask people to select and identify whether or not any one of those 10 were part of their development when they were a child, as they were growing up. And what they found when they look at mental health, right? When they look at some of the behavioral issues like addiction, heavy smoking, alcoholism, when they would look at things like diabetes, obesity, heart attacks, stroke, they look at this outcomes of an adult over years and the sicknesses and the difficulties, and then they looked at the scores or the way that they're tested. They found that the higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, the more likely, right, the higher their risk of having some type of physical, emotional, or behavioral problem. Kind of common sense, right? It's like, yeah, we know that. Yeah, but it's interesting to think of that study because it began to help them really begin to see, yeah, we kind of thought that, but now we have some studies that are beginning to say it's true, right? And that when a child has maybe one of those 10 things, there's less likelihood that they're going to have those problems. But as the numbers go up, their risk, not guaranteed, but their risk is higher. And so that's interesting, that's scary, and it's kind of depressing, right? I mean, when we look at our lives, like, oh my gosh, if I take that score, I think I'm a 5. Well, to be honest with you, I think I'm a 5 or 6 when I look at my life, right? And so that's the first part of the story. And so when I look at my life, right? So let me use me as an example. My parents were pretty good and they were probably raised really well and they had very little of that, but they had very heavy trauma, a war trauma in their lives. And so even though they should have been able to raise and love me well, everything in them wanted to love me well, they were both really broken. And they didn't have any supports. They didn't have what you see around you here, right? They didn't have those things. They didn't have the conversations about why are you struggling? So what happened in our childhood, as my parents got married, like I think 1 month after my father stepped back out of the Korean War, after the Korean War ended, my father met my mother and married. My mom just turned 19, my father was 21. And then 12 years, my mother had 9 children. So my mother, because of the trauma, and I think also some genetic, some biological pieces, some biological parts of who we are as a family, we have a susceptibility to some mental health issues. There is a lot of bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, ADHD in my extended family. My mom, when she gave birth to her first daughter, my oldest sister, had at that time they called them nervous breakdowns. But she had postpartum depression. She became very depressed. And then she got so depressed, she became psychotic. And she ended up in a hospital for 9 months. So the first 9 months of my sister's life, my mother was in a hospital. It was my grandmother that raised her. And then she continued to have children. And my dad and my mom kind of knew what was right. They kept struggling to try to figure out how to raise us. My father takes us to New York in that picture you saw in 1965, right? We already had 8 kids by that time. What was happening in our lives in that picture? At that time, in New York, my father had taken my mother away from my mom. Now, it's really interesting. My mother was very close to her family. Her family was her support. Her family was her healing. Her family was her strength. And so he took her away after she got better. They started having more kids, took her to New York, and my mother continued to have children. And there was nobody. She didn't know anybody in New York. She had no supports around her. It was hard. 9 kids in 12 years, that's hard work, right? And she would fall into depression. And a lot of times, so not only did my mother have a mental health illness, right? One of those 10 adverse childhood experiences. What that meant was my mother was oftentimes depressed, and my mother was hospitalized. I remember very clearly, at 8 years old, my mother right after she had my brother Jerry, she went into depression and ended up being hospitalized. She went into an institution. At that time, they did all kinds of things they don't do now, right? She had shock therapy. She had all kinds of things. We were separated from our mother. And that happened again a year and a half later. And I remember that second time it happened, or actually her third break, second time in New York. I remember it really well. Because I remember that was a really traumatic time when my mother in 1964 had a break. I don't remember almost none of it. But my father would take us to the hospital every week to see her, and most of the time she wouldn't come out. Because she would go cry, she would just cry. I hate hearing my mother cry, I can't handle it. Because that's what we heard a lot. It was traumatizing. It meant separation, right? So I had a mother with a mental health issue who was oftentimes depressed. Because of that, I was also emotionally neglected. Now my father was also impacted by war. And what that meant for my father is he would get angry, right? His way of handling his emotions is anger. He didn't know how to process it. And he was doing pretty good in our early years, but when my mom started falling apart, my father began to become more and more violent and more angry, right? He's trying to raise 9 kids. He wants to love us well. In many ways, he was the nurturer. He was the one that took care of us when my mom was depressed, but he began to really struggle. So during that time when my mom was hospitalized in New York in 1964, not only were we separated from my mother and saw a lot of her mental health issues, right? But my father was becoming emotionally angry, right? So there's a lot of emotional abuse. He began to become more physically abusive. And we were sexually molested as children because there was different people coming in trying to help my dad. So those ACE scores are rising. They're getting higher in my life and in my brothers and in all our lives. It's a reality, right? It's a truth that's happening, and we were known as the wild, crazy kids in our family, in our extended family. You know, they were pretty good families. They had family gatherings. We were a part of them. We were the kids that were pretty unpredictable, right? And so that brings me to another point, though. Even though all those things happened, the next slide, what the studies find, and this is really fascinating too. So there's that study that says, wow, adverse experiences can really impact. Things that happen in a child's life can really impact how they grow. And it almost feels like a death sentence when you think about that. But there's other studies, and what they know is this. Your history of connection is a better predictor of your health than what happens to you. What does that mean? This is a picture of my mother's family in Vallejo, California. This was right after my mom got out of the hospital for the second time in New York, and my grandparents came and they took us back to California so we could be close to her. So they all moved. This is that extended family, right? Connection is a better predictor of health. My grandparents loved us. They loved us passionately. And when my mom struggled, they found ways to be there, somehow to be there, right? To hold us, to soothe us, to somehow be there. And not only that, but my aunties, I had 2 aunts and an uncle, younger than my mom. They also became very involved in our lives. When I came back, we were pretty traumatized by that. But I remember very clearly my Aunt Terry and my Uncle Juan made a big difference in my life because they drew close to me. They would do things. My aunt would have me over. It helped her because I was older, and so I could help babysit some of her kids. But she spent time with me. She cared for me. She checked in on me. She took me places. She talked to me. She stayed up with me. You know, she laughed with me. She taught me how to make tamales. She taught me how to do things that my mom didn't do. My mom was barely able to hold her life together. It was my auntie that taught me that. My Uncle Juan, he had a really bright son, which means that that really bright son had a hard time getting along with kids his age. So he recognized that I might be a good partner. I was about 3 years older than him. So he began to also have me come over, and I would spend time with his 2 children. And they were a really healthy family, right? Their marriage was really working. They only had 2, they didn't have 9 kids. And they were able to do it, right? They were doing well. And so my uncle would spend time with me. He would take me places. And my aunt, his wife, my auntie, she's the one that taught me things like how to put a bra on. You know, I mean, that's really embarrassing. But my mom never talked to me about stuff like that. It's my aunt that did, right? So these people were really important. Connection is really important. Relationship is really important. No matter what you have gone through, no matter what you regret, there's so many regrets when we look at our lives, especially as parents. Nothing torments us more as a parent, right, than regret. Oh, why did I do that? Well, connection is a really important part. So when we look at the next slide, I'm just going to throw up this name, Bruce Perry. He's an author, but he's also a speaker. I was just at a conference last week. He was one of the speakers. Loved listening to him. Talks about child development. But he spent quite a bit of time talking again about connection, about relationships. And these are a couple books that he's written. Kind of interesting. One is called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. But he talks about, he works with traumatized children. And he talks about how they're healthy, how they found their way to health. And so the next slide, your superpower as a parent, right? Your superpower as a coach, your superpower as a parent, right, is how you connect. Those relationships, your ability to have a relationship with your child, with children, with young people. Right? That's your superpower, your capacity, your ability, not just to show up and be there. And that's a common thing, right? I mean, I've done that. I parented. You walk in and it's like, well, thank God I'm here. Can you please pick up your shoes, you know? And that's a reality. That's life. But what is your ability? What is your capacity to actually be there, emotionally present, right? And available to your children? What does that mean? What does that look like? What is your capacity and ability to do that? The greater that capacity, the greater your superpower to really help your children and your families. Next one. Adversity, so we're talking about child experiences, difficult, hard, challenging, soul-destroying, traumatic things, right? They heighten what we call toxic stress, and I'm not going to talk about brain and any of that, but it's important to know that when children, or when we have gone through those things, stress is high, right? Stress is high in the home when there's violence in the home. Stress is high, right? Things happen and children don't know how to handle that. It affects their brain, it affects their ability to learn, right? It affects their ability to process. Adversity heightens toxic stress. And not receiving comfort, right, or release from stress robs us. It robs us of feeling safe. It robs us of feeling capable. It robs us of feeling lovable. And it robs life from making sense. When there's lots of adversity, there's lots of toxic stress. Your children are developing. There's these things. Maybe they're in your control, maybe they're not, right? But the reality is there's lots of stress there. And if you don't find a way to comfort and release that, right? If you don't have a way of doing that, that child doesn't get that. These are the things that are being taken from them and robbed from them. We would never let our homes be robbed. We lock our doors, right? We don't want some stranger walking into our homes, taking things from us. But when we can't do those things, when we're not providing that, we're allowing our children to be robbed. We're allowing them to be robbed of a sense of safety, of knowing that they're capable and they're loved, if we don't figure that piece out. And a lot of it has to do with you and your ability, right, to soothe and to comfort. So next slide. There's another study. I'm just throwing that name of it. I personally, part of my healing is I love to learn. I read all kinds of stuff. That was part of my growth and my healing as well. Dr. Emmy Werner, Kauai study. The big takeaway, they don't need 1 million relationships. They don't need 5 relationships. They don't need even 2. One really healthy relationship can make a huge difference in a child and an adult's life. One. Nice to have more, absolutely. But really, just one. One person who has that capacity to gently calm or comfort a child, right? Who can protect them from ongoing stress, who has the ability, maybe things aren't going well, but hey, let's go, let's do this, let's do that. I'm gonna keep you away from that as much as I can, and I'm gonna provide some comfort to you, and I'm gonna build your emotional strength, right? I'm gonna have those conversations, I'm gonna be your auntie, and we're gonna laugh even though things are hard, and even though you had a terrible day, right? I'm gonna help you, and I'm gonna show you how to make tamales, and this is gonna be great. Right? And we're going to laugh, and we're going to talk, and I'm going to enjoy you. Families do this for all the time, right? This is a history of human existence. The history of human existence is that there are lots of crappy things that happen. There's lots of trauma. There's lots of adverse experiences. There's lots of things we have no control of, and some things we do, but we can't seem to change it, right? And yet people thrive. Why? Because you have people in their lives. Because just like you might have someone who's the source of all your pain, you also have someone, or please make sure there is someone who's also a source of comfort and joy. One person. Next slide. Healthy, stable relationships. Healing is possible through relationships. It's people, not programs, that change people. And so I was just talking a little bit. There's all these programs here. This is part of your community. There's lots of sources, and some of them there's some really great, what they call evidence-based programs. What does that mean? That means they've done some studies and they found that if you effectively do certain things, you can have really good results and help people. Those are really important. But you know what they also find? That some programs do better than others. Some programs have better results. Some programs create healthier communities and healthier families and healthier children than others. Why? People. It has to do with the people in your program. It's people doing the right things together in the right ways at the right time that actually can develop and can provide really helpful programs. I am so glad to see that you guys are a part of a community that has services for your children as well as for you. Probably a lot of them, I suspect, most of them, are not only doing the right things in the right ways at the right time, but they're the right people. Healthy people. Healthy people. People with lots of capacity. People with the ability to be emotionally present for other people and actually really care, right? Can bring a tremendous amount of healing and hope to others. I know this. Working at the crisis lines, I train. We train 300 volunteers a year to work on our lines. One of the trainings I do is how to provide a suicide intervention, right? How to take somebody, how to be present for someone who's in a high state of crisis and who's feeling very overwhelmed, right? And very scared, and how to connect with them in a real, present way, right? And to hear their pain, not their pain, and bring them to a place of recognizing they also have a reason to live. I train people in that. And on the first day of the training, you know what I do? At the end of the first day, I look at them after they've gone through a really hard emotional day, because one of the things is we ask them to kind of spend some time understanding where they're at and how they feel about the topic of suicide in and of itself. You know, what are some of their thoughts on that? We go through a lot. So at the end of the day, I look at them and I say, now I'm going to give you homework. And they're like, what? This has been a hard day. Yes, you know what the homework is? I tell them to do something for themselves. I tell them that today, I want you, your homework, what I'm requiring of you as someone who's going to be certified by my training, is to go home and do something for yourself. You love to run? Go run. You love having dinner, a good dinner? Go get some dinner. You love hugging your children and playing with them? Do it. Do something that replenishes you, that meets your need, that takes care of you, that fills you up. Because the truth is, I know working with suicide and training people to handle suicide, people are giving everything in them to help someone in a very difficult state. You can't do that if you're empty. You can't do that if you're constantly giving and never receiving, never giving yourself something. You have to. Self-care is so important. And so what do we mean by capacity to be there for others? That means taking care of a little bit of self. That means filling yourself up a little bit, making sure you're in an emotional space to do that. So next slide. Provide a warm, responsive relationship. Respect. I know we want, respect me. I want you to respect me. You know, we raise our kids, don't talk back to me that way, don't talk to me that way. We want respect. But you know what teaches respect to children? Is respecting them and respecting others. Parents who respect each other, who show respect for their children, get children who respect back. And it's a really important, you know, like, what do we mean by respect? Well, there's something in us, right? We know that there's value and worth. We are all have value. That's a really important, there's a sense of our dignity, who I am as a human being is really important. And when you do things, right, that disregard my dignity, my sense of who I am, right? You're disrespecting me. That is hard. That is shaming. And it's not healthy. Provide comfort and support in times of stress. I remember my granddaughter. We were at a wedding, outside wedding. She's like 8 years old at the time. She got rebuked by one of the parents. There was a kids' table. Something happened. It was typical stupid kid stuff. But she was really embarrassed and humiliated because the adult, who was stressed, corrected her in front of some friends, and it just really hurt her. She was so embarrassed. So she comes running, she comes to me, and she's crying, and she's really upset, right? And I didn't say, hey, honey, it's okay. I mean, it's not that big a deal, come on. No, I put her out, let her sit on my lap, and I just let her sob on me. I didn't do anything, I just held her. I held her, and I held her just as long as she felt like she needed it, and I didn't care. I didn't try to explain anything away. I didn't talk about it. I just held her until she felt okay. And then I said, so how are you? Do you want to talk? We talked a little bit. And then she ran off to go play. I comforted her. I just soothed her. I just sat there. I didn't use any type of psychology, right? I just, as a natural instinct, right? I held my grandchild. I love that grandchild, and I'm not gonna I didn't go track down the mother and say, why did you do that? I just held my child, and then my grandchild, not my child, my grandchild. I comforted her, and I made sure that she knows I care for you no matter what. No matter what, I care for you. Next slide. My home, my school, my neighborhood. It's really important that if you want your child to be healthy, that you not only have a really warm, caring relationship, but you think about my home, my school, my neighborhood, is it physically and emotionally safe? We do this even at my work. Again, we're dealing with people who are traumatized on these phones. And some of those people have trauma in their lives. That's why they're on those phones. They've actually probably maybe survived the loss of somebody to suicide. Or maybe they themselves have attempted suicide, right? We have some of those volunteers in our lives. They have trauma in their lives. And so it's really important that our place where we work is safe. It's a physically and emotionally safe place, right? We think about those things all the time. Like, what is it like to be here? What are the things going on? How can we make this a healthy, safe space? The other thing children need, consistent, predictable routines and expectations, right? Those are important. We were crazy wild kids. Part of it is because my mother, who was the main caretaker and was struggling with her issues, not only was she not able to provide emotional support, and so we were very neglected, and sometimes even physically neglected, depending on how well she was doing. But there was like not a lot of routine, right? Our joke, my family, my siblings were actually really close. Our joke is we raised each other, right? We created our own routines, because it wasn't always there. It wasn't always clear. Next slide. Model self-regulation. So, it's one thing to tell your child to control their temper. It's another thing to control your own, right? I mean, the best way you can tell your child, you can't have it, that's not okay. No, you can't throw yourself on this, that is not okay. You are gonna be in big trouble, right? But then I turn around and I flip out, right? It's like, I flip out on someone, right? I am not controlling my behavior, but I'm telling my child to control their behavior. If you want your child to learn how to regulate their emotions, you have to learn to regulate your own. You have to model it. It's about instructing them, teaching them, talking to them, and doing it yourself, right? Opportunities. Next slide. So, this brings me to the next piece. So, I can talk forever, so I'll try to be aware of time. All right, this brings it down. So, I've talked about diversity. I talked about healthy relationships and connections. I felt like when I decided to have my children, I got married, had my children, my husband and I both also had trauma in our lives. We wanted to love our children well. And it was almost like we're standing on this mountain, and we're seeing this other mountain, and it's like everything we want is to love our children well, to be emotionally there for them, to support them, to love them, right? To be good parents, that's what we want. It's that mountain over there. But I'm standing on a bunch of crap. And I might have learned how to be a pretty good adult. I got myself through college, right? I was a teacher, I was doing some really good things. I actually was pretty healthy. I had some healthy relationships in my life. But I also, getting married, there's nothing like getting married and beginning to have children to trigger your own problems, right? I did pretty good until I got married and started having kids. And then we start triggering stuff in our life, things start coming up that we thought, we were past that, right? And so this is my husband and me just before we got married. And the pictures around are different pictures of my children and as we were growing up, and the grandchildren I think are even on there, some of them. So to love your children well, next slide. You need to do the hard work and take care of you. So I said this a little bit, I hinted at this. So this picture is me on the far side here, and eight of us. My oldest sister is already married and out of the home. But that was hard. That was a hard time in my life, going up to that point. There was a lot of things. I think it was like a couple of years after that time, right after I graduated from college and I was in graduate school, I became really suicidal. I began to struggle with depression. I wasn't married yet, but I was struggling. I had to continually, look back and deal with my own issues. And so then I'm married, and here I am now, a few years ahead, and I'm with my husband, and we're having kids, and stress is building, and I tend to numb out, and he tends to, when he's overwhelmed, get verbally angry, right, and emotionally abusive. And I tend to numb out and become insecure and unsure of what's the right thing to do. And I wanted to love my children well, but I was struggling to know how to do that. And so my lesson was, and my lesson to you is, you want to love your children well. You have to fight to take care of you. You have to be willing to go through the valley of hard times. You have to be willing to go there. And there's lots of programs, and there's lots of people that can support you through that process, and we do it in different ways. I actually never went to any type of support program, but I'm a person of faith. And when I was suicidal at this time, I came to a place, I hadn't lived and gone to church in a long time. I was raised in it, but I didn't. But I came to a place where it's like, you are either real, God, you are real, or you're not. And if you're not, I don't know why I'm alive. But you gotta show me you're real. And faith became an important core component. And it was a core component of my husband. And so that became the core component of who we were when we got married. And as we struggled, the one really healthy thing I did, there's quite a few things, but I'm gonna end it with this. The most healthy thing I did, well, there's a few, but one of them was when we moved from Guam. We met in Guam, married, had our first 2 kids, and we settled in Oregon in 1987. We became a part of a church congregation. We've stayed with them that whole time. That was my community. I started this with strength and community. When I was growing up, my strength was my extended Guam, my Pacific Island extended family. They still are. But that extended family was my strength. They provided relationships that genuinely cared for me. They weren't perfect. They failed me sometimes, but they also loved me. When I moved to Oregon, I didn't know anybody really. We didn't really know anybody. I had a sister. But by being a part of a faith community, I built an extended family. My children were provided other relationships in their life. They had other healthy relationships. And so take care of you. Find out who your community is. Address your issues. You love your kids, deal with your issues. Get help. You want your children to seek help when they're struggling? You seek help. Seek help for yourself. Get those supports. Get those relationships. Build a healthy, strong community around you, whether it's faith, or whether it's sports, or whether it's school things like this. Build it. And you will. Those adverse experiences don't have to define you. It's your relationships, and it's your capacity to give. Thank you.